Ukraine supplies wheat exports have left the country via Black Sea ports. This is as Russia continues to block millions of tons of grain in those ports. Now, according to the World Food Programme, this is likely to affect most of African countries. Joining us to tell us how this blockage is likely going to affect most of the continent is Dr. Greg Mills, who is the director of the Brenthurst Foundation. Dr. Greg Mills, thank you so much for joining us. Now, what's interesting is that food insecurity and hunger across the globe has been rising even before the war in Ukraine. Now, can you explain to us some of the pre-existing drivers of food insecurity and how this invasion is likely to make things worse, especially in Africa?
Well, the principal drivers of food insecurity are low yields in Africa, and that's a factor, of course, related to fertilizer usage, related to mechanization, and in the African instance, given the absence of mechanization across much of the continent, it relates to the drought and the ongoing drought, particularly in parts of Eastern Africa. And it's this compounding series of issues between low yields, now very expensive fertilizer, high.
All right, it seems as though we lost the audio there for Dr. Greg Mills. Hopefully we'll be able to connect with him as we would like to have this conversation, because we do know how much the African continent is being impacted, especially when it comes to the war that has happened in Ukraine, and the prices in oil, the prices in wheat, and the prices in maize have now been soaring. Now, on to some international news. When Britain left the European Union, politicians promised economic benefits for parts of the country which had previously fallen behind. Outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledged that the levelling up policy would see improved transport links and job prospects. But the inflation at its highest level in decades and the so-called Brexit dividend yet to materialize, residents of cities like Bradford are wondering if Johnson's policy was any more than just a campaign slogan.
Every time a train comes into Bradford station, when all its passengers have boarded, it has to reverse out again to leave. The lack of a through line symbolises the poor transport links which can leave this city of 500,000 feeling like it's a dead end. Prime Minister Boris Johnson won the 2019 election with a promise to level up parts of Britain which felt left behind. Better rail links were a key part of this pledge, with a high-speed line planned to link Bradford with Manchester and Leeds. But in 2021, that plan was cancelled, leaving locals feeling the Prime Minister had let them down.
I think it should be fair to everybody. You know, I think everybody should get something, but it doesn't always work like that, does it, unfortunately?
Levelling up was meant to be a benefit of Brexit, with new funds unlocked for parts of Britain outside the prosperous South East. But with the economy now struggling, plans are being scaled back. That's frustrating for companies like this aerospace business on Bradford's outskirts. The poor transport links make it difficult to attract skilled workers. They had set their hopes on the promised rail upgrade.
It's very disappointing for Bradford. Asking for what we should have had for a long, long time is not a big ask. We're not asking for a space shuttle. All we're asking for is what Europe and what the south of England already has.
There are some tangible benefits of levelling up funds. Elsewhere in the north of England, this housing estate has received a grant for much-needed renovation work. But given the rising inflation rate and worsening economic outlook, in many cases money meant to improve services will just help them stand still. Back in Bradford, this food bank has received levelling up funds, but with the number of users rising, they're worried they still won't be able to cover growing needs.
We all know inflation's going up, by a lot, but it's people that are on the lowest incomes that will suffer the most, because the products that they're buying, the basic food, isn't just going up by 10% or whatever, it's going up by 100%. And I just don't know how people are going to survive unless the government really does do something in the next budget to increase people's money that they get in their pockets.
In May, the government announced a £15 billion support package to help with soaring energy costs. But there are already calls for much more to be done. Carl volunteers at the food bank and used to rely on its services. With inflation at its highest in 40 years, he's concerned for the future.
I can't see it getting any easier for me, and the numbers since I've been a volunteer have only multiplied, and I can only see it getting worse if something isn't really looked at in the mass, you know. I mean, I've barely got 40 quid by the time I paid everything out of my own, you know, so I imagine even families are struggling far worse than I do.
In this context, the promised benefits of levelling up are much needed. But with Boris Johnson preparing to leave office, the policy remains far from complete.
Now we continue that conversation with Dr. Greg Mills, who is a director at the Brenthurst Foundation, and we were speaking about the impact of the Russian invasion war into Ukraine and what the impact is on food security in Africa. Now, Doctor, so when we were discussing some of the things that influence the food insecurity, what particular food products are being affected by the war in Ukraine? Any specific foods that have been directly impacted by this war that's coming into Africa?
Yeah, Ukraine supplies about 10% of global wheat, but it's a very big grain supplier overall. And it's an especially big supplier to parts of Eastern Africa and to parts of North Africa with grains. The places like Ethiopia used to get more than their grains from Ukraine. And then Ukraine supplies an extraordinary 1/2 of the world export market in vegetable oil. And this is why you're seeing these compounding effects of droughts, of low yields in Africa, and now a cut-off in supplies compounded by high fertilizer prices and high fuel prices, which have led to, considerable hardship and increasing food insecurity in parts of Africa.
So which are the countries that we'd say would most likely be affected from the import of these goods?
Well, as a broad measure, it's those that are suffering drought. And it's particularly those that are in situations of conflict, which make it very hard to move food around and, of course, make agricultural production that much more difficult. So especially at the moment, Somalia, about half the population of Somalia, of 15 million people, are facing food insecurity. It's big parts of Ethiopia. Of course, they have a civil war all of their own, and very low yields, in part, again, because of fertilizer prices. So basically anywhere in the Horn of Africa and parts of East Africa. North Africa, I think, has the resources probably to get other supplies in, but it's really this part of Eastern Africa and then bits of the Sahel which are most concerning. But it is, as the WFP has said, the World Food Programme, a perfect storm within a perfect storm, because this comes on the back of COVID. It comes back on the back of people not being very vulnerable, a lot of unemployment around. And when you're suddenly faced with, as you are now, a 75% increase in things like vegetable oil, it's really going to hit hard, and particularly in winter months in southern Africa, the cost of fuel prices going up is going to impact on those trying to get to work, for instance, and leave less in the way of disposable income for goods which have now become that much more expensive. So it's absolutely critical that Ukraine can open those Black Sea ports where there's about 4.5 million tons in storage, of about 25 million tons in Ukraine overall in storage, and then a harvest waiting to move out over this next season of as much as 80 million tons. If we can get those ports open and moving, if Russia actually allows this to happen, the crisis will to some extent be averted.
All right, thank you for your time. That's all we have time for. That's Dr. Greg Mills, who's a director at the Brenthurst Foundation, giving us his input on what the Russia-Ukraine war has an impact on the food supply in Africa.